She ordered a husband through the mail and got a gunslinger instead. A woman alone, a dying ranch, a stranger stepping off a train, armed, dangerous, and carrying a secret that would shatter everything she thought she knew. But the letters, those letters written by a ghost, signed by a killer, and somehow meant for her soul. What happens when the man you fell in love with never existed, and the man standing in front of you is something far more dangerous and far more real? This story reminds us that sometimes the love we were searching for doesn't arrive in the shape we imagined. It arrives in the shape we needed. Welcome to a channel where the West is more than dust and gunfire. If that hits something in your chest, leave a comment and subscribe.
The Montana wind possessed a cruelty unique to late autumn. It didn't just blow, it scoured, carrying bitter grit that stung the cheeks and promised a brutal winter. Evelyn Montgomery stood on the splintered wooden platform of the Oak Haven station, her wool shawl pulled tight against the chill. In her gloved hands, she clutched a small stack of letters tied with a frayed blue ribbon. They were her lifeline. She ran her thumb over the crisp parchment of the top envelope. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping, and precise. Arthur Penhaligon. He was a man of numbers and books, an accountant from Philadelphia who quoted poetry and spoke of building a quiet, honest life under the expansive western sky. For 6 months, his words had been the only thing holding the crushing weight of her reality at bay. Since her father's sudden passing, the ranch, 160 acres of prime, water-rich grazing land, had become a target. A woman alone in the territory was a vulnerability the local bank was all too eager to exploit. Evelyn needed a husband to secure the deed. Arthur needed a fresh start. It was a transaction of necessity, softened by the undeniable growing affection in their correspondence. In her mind, she had painted a picture of him, soft-spoken, perhaps a bit pale from city living, with gentle hands and a warm smile. A man of peace. The distant, mournful shriek of a train whistle shattered her thoughts. The Northern Pacific locomotive roared into the station, a massive beast of black iron and billowing white steam. Brakes shrieked, metal grinding against metal, sending a violent shudder through the platform boards beneath Evelyn's boots. As the train hissed to a halt, the conductor stepped out, lowering the iron steps. Evelyn's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed the front of her dark blue traveling dress, suddenly hyper-aware of the wind-blown state of her auburn hair. A family of homesteaders disembarked first, looking exhausted. Then a traveling salesman dragging a heavy leather sample case. Evelyn waited. The platform began to clear. There was no sign of a gentle scholar. Then a final passenger stepped out of the shadows of the rail car. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace that instantly set Evelyn's nerves on edge. He was tall, over 6 feet, and broad-shouldered, wearing a long, dust-caked canvas duster that swept the tops of his scuffed leather boots. A low-crowned Stetson was pulled down, casting a dark shadow over his eyes. When he reached the platform, he didn't look around with the wide-eyed wonder of a city man. His gaze swept the station, the rooftops, and the tree line with cold, calculated precision. He was assessing threats. He reached into the pocket of his dark vest and pulled out a silver pocket watch. The heavy tick-tick-tick of the mechanism was audible even over the dying hiss of the train. He checked the time, snapped the silver casing shut with a sharp clack, and slipped it away. As he turned his head, the late afternoon sun caught his face. It was a strikingly handsome face, all sharp angles and hard jawline, entirely devoid of the scars one might expect on a man of his bearing. Yet he looked infinitely dangerous. The way he stood, the way he breathed, everything about him screamed violence. And then Evelyn saw it. The heavy dark leather holster strapped low on his right thigh, housing a Colt .45 with a worn wooden grip. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't Arthur. The stranger's pale, piercing eyes locked onto her. He walked forward, his spurs letting out a faint metallic jingle with every measured step. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough to speak, far enough to react if she drew a weapon. "Evelyn Montgomery?" His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It sounded like a man who hadn't spoken in days. Evelyn instinctively took a half-step back, her grip tightening on the letters. "I am. Who are you? Where is Mr. Penhaligon?" The stranger took off his hat, revealing thick, dark hair. He held the brim in his large, calloused hands. "My name is Silas Vance." He paused, a muscle ticking in his jaw as he looked down at the letters in her hands. "I'm sorry, Miss Montgomery. Arthur isn't coming." "What do you mean he isn't coming?" Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. "We have an agreement. The magistrate is expecting us within the hour." "Arthur caught the fever in St. Louis," Silas said, his voice completely flat, though a shadow darkened his eyes. "It took him fast. He passed away 2 weeks ago." The wind seemed to stop. The world tilted sideways. Dead. The poetic, gentle man who had promised her salvation, who had written about the stars over the prairie. Gone. Evelyn swayed, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Silas reached out a hand to steady her, but dropped it before making contact. "Before he died, he made me swear an oath. He told me about your arrangement, about the bank." Silas met her eyes, his gaze unflinching. "He knew what would happen to you if a man didn't step off this train. So, he asked me to take his place." Evelyn stared at him, her mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the statement. She looked at his broad chest, his rough hands, and the lethal weapon strapped to his hip. "Take his place?" she repeated, her voice trembling, not with sorrow but with rising, incredulous anger. "Arthur was a scholar, an accountant. He was going to help me run the books and manage the herd." "I can work a ranch," Silas replied evenly. "I'm not afraid of hard labor, and I keep my word. The deal remains the same. A legal marriage on paper. I'll secure your deed, keep the wolves off your porch, and sleep in the barn. When you're safe, and you ask me to, I'll ride out." "You must be out of your mind." Evelyn's grief evaporated, replaced by a fiery, desperate indignation. She shoved the bundle of letters toward his chest. "I needed a partner. I needed the man who wrote these words. I ordered a husband, Mr. Vance, not an armed cowboy." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't offer a defense. He just stood there, absorbing her fury like a stone wall taking the brunt of a storm. "Arthur was a good man," he said softly. "But a good man with a pen wouldn't have survived a week against the people trying to take your land. You need a gun. You just don't know it yet." "I don't need a hired killer in my home," she snapped, tears of absolute frustration finally burning her eyes. She turned her back on him, gripping her skirts. "The arrangement is cancelled. Tell whatever ghost you answer to that Evelyn Montgomery will handle her own affairs." She took 3 furious steps toward the edge of the platform before a voice, slick as oiled leather, stopped her in her tracks. "Well now, Miss Montgomery, running away from your own welcoming party?" Evelyn froze. Stepping out from the shadow of the station master's office was Harlan Thorne's right-hand man, and the town's chief loan officer, Josiah Crane. He was a weasel of a man in a pinstripe suit, twirling a walking stick with arrogant amusement. 2 heavily armed ranch hands flanked him, their eyes crawling over Evelyn with undisguised disrespect. "Mr. Crane," Evelyn said, forcing her spine straight, "my business at the station is concluded." "Is it?" Crane chuckled, stepping into her path. He glanced past her at Silas, then dismissed him as just another drifting hired gun. "Because word around town was that you were picking up a fiancée today. But seeing as how you're walking away alone, I assume the coward got cold feet? That is none of your concern." "It's entirely my concern, Evelyn," Crane said, his smile dropping into a predatory sneer. "The grace period on your father's loan expired at noon. The only thing staying my hand was the promise of a male guarantor to co-sign the restructuring. A husband." He tapped his cane on the wooden boards. since you are still a vulnerable, unmarried woman incapable of managing an estate. The bank is foreclosing. I'll have the sheriff at your property by nightfall to escort you off the premises." The air left Evelyn's lungs. Nightfall. It was over. Everything she and her father had bled for, gone in an instant. She opened her mouth to argue, to beg, to fight, but she had no weapons left. Before she could speak, a large, dark shape moved past her shoulder. Silas Vance stepped between Evelyn and the banker. He didn't walk, he glided. He stopped with his boots planted shoulder-width apart, his tall frame entirely eclipsing Evelyn from Crane's view. Crane frowned, taking a step back as the sheer imposing reality of the man registered. "And who the hell are you?" Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "I'm the guarantor." Silas's right hand rested casually on his thigh. With a motion so fast Evelyn barely saw it, his thumb flicked the hammer of his Colt .45. Clack, clack. The sharp metallic sound of the heavy revolver cocking echoed across the dead silence of the train platform. Crane's two armed men instantly froze, their hands hovering miles away from their own holsters, realizing they were already dead if they twitched. Silas tilted his Stetson back, his pale eyes locking onto the banker with the cold, dead promise of a freshly dug grave. "The lady is spoken for," Silas said softly. "Now step aside, before I foreclose on your breathing." The marriage of Evelyn Montgomery and Silas Vance took less than 10 minutes. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, old ink, and quiet desperation. Oak Haven's local magistrate, a balding man who usually dragged out these proceedings to self-important lengths, rushed through the vows. He kept casting nervous glances at the tall, dark-haired gunslinger standing rigidly in his cramped office. Silas hadn't unbuckled his gun belt. He hadn't even taken off his dust-caked coat. He simply stood there, an immovable force of nature, radiating a quiet, lethal impatience that made the air in the room feel thin. When it came time for the rings, Silas reached into his vest pocket. He didn't pull out the silver watch Evelyn had seen earlier, but a simple, unadorned band of polished iron. "Belonged to my mother," he murmured, his voice so low only Evelyn could hear it. Before she could process the unexpected intimacy of the gesture, his large, calloused fingers took her trembling left hand. His touch was shockingly warm against her cold skin. He slid the iron ring onto her finger. It was slightly too big, heavy, and completely devoid of romance. It was a shackle of survival. Evelyn signed the marriage certificate with a hand that barely recognized its own signature. Evelyn Vance. She stared at the wet ink, mourning the life she had imagined just an hour ago. Arthur was supposed to sign this paper. Arthur was supposed to hold her hand. Instead, Silas took the pen and slashed his name across the bottom line with aggressive, sharp strokes. The ride back to the Montgomery ranch was swallowed by a deafening, tense silence. Evelyn drove her buckboard wagon, her eyes fixed on the rutted dirt road, while Silas rode his massive black gelding alongside her. He didn't attempt small talk. His pale eyes were in constant motion, scanning the rolling Montana foothills, the dense line of pine trees, and the darkening horizon. He rode like a cavalry scout, moving through hostile territory. When the ranch finally came into view, a modest two-story timber house flanked by a sturdy barn and a corral, Evelyn felt a fierce protective ache in her chest. This was her blood and sweat. This was her father's legacy. She pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch and set the brake. Silas dismounted smoothly, tying his horse to the hitching post before turning to face her. "Let's get one thing straight, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, her voice sharp as cracked ice as she climbed down from the wagon. She refused to let him see the lingering terror Crane had instilled in her. "This is a business arrangement, a legal shield to keep the bank off my porch, nothing more." Silas didn't blink. He stood in the fading light, the wind catching the hem of his long duster. "I didn't ask for a wife, Miss Montgomery. I'm here to honor a debt to a dead man, that's all." "Good. Then we understand each other." She pointed toward the large wooden structure across the yard. "You will sleep in the barn. There is a cot in the tack room and a cast-iron stove to keep you from freezing. You do not come into the main house unless invited. I will cook your meals, and in exchange you will help maintain the perimeter and assist with the heavy labor my father used to handle." Silas looked at the barn, then back at the house. His jaw tightened, but he gave a single curt nod. "Understood. I take the barn. I keep you breathing. And when the deed is legally secured and the bank backs off permanently, I ride out." "Exactly," Evelyn said, though the absolute certainty in his voice sent an odd, hollow pang through her stomach. She looked at him closer, noticing the deep purple shadows beneath his eyes, the tight lines of exhaustion bracketing his mouth. He looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night in years. He carried a burden she couldn't name, heavy and suffocating. "I'll unpack my gear," Silas said roughly, turning away from her scrutiny. An hour later, the bitter Montana night had fully descended. Evelyn sat at the sturdy oak table in her kitchen, bathed in the warm yellow glow of a kerosene lamp. The marriage certificate and the deed to the ranch were spread out before her. The back door opened with a groan of protesting hinges. Silas stepped inside, bringing the scent of pine needles, cold air, and horse sweat with him. Evelyn stiffened, but gestured to the empty chair across from her. "We need to review the bank's terms," she said, her tone all business. "Tomorrow we ride into town and file the paperwork. I need to know you understand the financial boundaries of this." Silas sat down heavily. He didn't look at the deed. He was staring at the flickering flame of the lamp, his pale eyes distant and clouded with a dark, brooding thought. The sheer exhaustion radiating from him was palpable. "Mr. Vance?" she prompted, irritated by his lack of attention. "Are you listening to me?" Silas didn't answer right away. He was deep in his own mind, wrestling with something unseen. As he stared blankly ahead, he rested his right hand on the wooden tabletop. Subconsciously, lost in thought, his index finger lifted and struck the wood. Tap, tap, tap. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a sudden, violent jolt of pure shock. She stared at his large, rough hand, the rhythmic, deliberate motion. 3 taps. "Whenever the loneliness of this city becomes too much, Evelyn, I find myself sitting at my desk thinking of the Montana sky you described. Without even realizing it, I tap my finger against the wood 3 times. Tap, 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 a rhythm for you, a heartbeat across the miles." The words from Arthur's 4th letter echoed in her mind with terrifying clarity. It was a highly specific idiosyncratic quirk, a habit belonging to a gentle accountant from Philadelphia. Why in the name of God was this lethal, hardened gunslinger doing the exact same thing? Silas blinked, the distant look clearing from his eyes. He pulled his hand back, completely unaware of what he had just done. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice gravelly. "You were saying about the bank?" Evelyn could only stare at him. The blood rushing in her ears as the first seed of an impossible, earth-shattering doubt took root in her mind. The next morning broke gray and freezing. Evelyn barely slept, her mind spinning in dizzying circles, haunted by the rhythmic tapping of Silas's finger and the heavy iron ring on her own hand. She wrapped her thick shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped out onto the back porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. She expected to find Silas splitting firewood or tending to the horses. Instead, a sharp, violent thwack echoed across the yard, followed by the groaning crunch of splintering wood. Evelyn hurried around the side of the house. Her blood ran instantly hot. Silas was standing near the parlor windows, his long duster discarded on the porch railing. He wore a dark Henley shirt, the sleeves pushed up over his forearms, revealing corded muscle and raw power. He was wielding her father's heavy-felling axe, burying the steel blade deep into the trunk of the massive, beautiful oak tree that had shaded the parlor for 20 years. It was her mother's favorite tree. "What are you doing?" Evelyn screamed, dropping her coffee mug. It shattered on the frozen dirt, dark liquid steaming in the cold air. Silas paused, the axe resting easily in his hands. He didn't look guilty, He looked analytical, clearing the sight line. "Are you insane?" Evelyn marched through the frost-hardened mud, her fists clenched at her sides. "That is a 200-year-old oak. You don't just chop it down without asking me." "It blocks the eastern approach to the house," Silas replied, his voice maddeningly calm as he wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "If someone rides up from the ridge, that canopy provides perfect cover. A shooter could sit in those branches and have a clean angle right into your parlor. It's a tactical nightmare. It comes down." "This is a ranch, not a military fortress," Evelyn shouted, planting herself directly between him and the half-chopped trunk. "You are acting like we are at war." Silas's eyes darkened, the pale irises turning the color of a winter storm. He stepped closer to her, the heavy axe hanging loosely from his grip. Suddenly, Evelyn was acutely aware of his overwhelming size. He towered over her, radiating a fierce, barely contained intensity. "You are at war, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating rumble. "Josiah Crane didn't look at you yesterday like a man who was just going to file some paperwork and walk away. Men like that don't surrender. They escalate. And when they do, I am not going to let a damn tree be the reason you catch a bullet through your window. You don't get to come onto my property and destroy it just to feed your own paranoia," she fired back, refusing to yield an inch. She tipped her chin up, glaring right into his eyes. "I am the owner of this land. I give the orders. You are here to sign a piece of paper, Silas Vance, not command an army." "My job is to keep you breathing," he snarled, stepping into her space. The distance between them vanished. Evelyn gasped softly, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She could smell him, a potent, dizzying mix of cut pine, gun oil, and the sharp, raw scent of male sweat. The sheer heat radiating off his large body was a shocking contrast to the freezing morning air. Silas stared down at her, his jaw locked tight. His eyes dropped for a fraction of a second to her lips, parted in breathless anger before snapping back to her eyes. The air between them suddenly felt thick, crackling with an electric tension that had absolutely nothing to do with the oak tree. The furious argument had abruptly transformed into something entirely different. A raw, untamed physical gravity was pulling them together, terrifying and undeniable. Silas realized it a second before she did. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He let out a harsh breath, stepping back and breaking the magnetic pull. He planted the axe head firmly into a nearby stump. "The tree stays," he grated out, his voice rougher than usual. He turned on his heel, grabbing his duster from the railing. "But if shooting starts, you stay the hell away from the parlor." Evelyn stood trembling in the cold as he stalked off toward the perimeter fence, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed her fingers to her lips, shocked by the sudden, treacherous flare of desire that had just eclipsed her anger. By late afternoon, the tension had settled into a simmering, unspoken truce. Silas was out repairing a section of the northern fence line. Evelyn walked out to the porch to fetch the heavy canvas duster Silas had left draped over the railing. It was caked in trail dust and smelled of wood smoke. She decided to brush it out, a small domestic olive branch after their explosive argument. She hoisted the heavy coat, shaking it out. It was shockingly heavy, weighted down by extra ammunition loops and hidden pockets. As she smoothed the rough canvas, her hand brushed against something stiff inside the deep interior pocket. Thinking it might be important documents, Evelyn reached inside. Her fingers closed around a folded, crumpled piece of paper. She pulled it out. It wasn't a banknote or a map. It looked like a piece of scrap paper torn from the edge of a ledger. Frowning, Evelyn unfolded it. There were lines of text scribbled across the page, words crossed out and rewritten, as if someone had been drafting a thought before committing it to a final page. Evelyn's eyes scanned the ink. The world stopped spinning. The air left her lungs in a sharp, silent gasp. "The Montana sky you describe sounds like a cathedral of stars. I often sit in the quiet of my room, tapping my finger against the desk, wondering if you are looking up at the same moon. I am a man of few virtues, Evelyn, but I swear to you, She knew these words. She knew them by heart. They were the exact verbatim lines from the fifth letter Arthur had sent her. But it wasn't just the words that made Evelyn's knees turn to water. It was the handwriting, the elegant, sweeping, precise strokes of the pen. It was the exact same handwriting that Silas Vance had slashed across their marriage certificate yesterday. Evelyn's fingers trembled violently, the crumpled paper shaking in her grip. She looked up, her wide, horrified eyes fixing on the distant silhouette of the gunslinger working the fence line. Arthur Penhaligon hadn't written those letters. Silas had. The Montana sky did not simply darken. It bruised. A heavy, violent purple swallowed the late afternoon sun, and the temperature plummeted so fast, the timber joints of the ranch house groaned in protest. Inside the kitchen, Evelyn sat frozen at the oak table, the crumpled draft of the letter smoothed out flat before her. Her pulse beat a frantic, uneven rhythm in her throat. She had spent the last 2 hours comparing the sweeping, elegant loops of the Arthur letters to the sharp, decisive signature on her marriage certificate, and finally, to the drafted scrap she had pulled from Silas's duster. They were identical. Every cross of a T, every trailing loop of a Y. He wrote them. Silas Vance wrote them. A profound, suffocating sense of betrayal warred with a terrifying, illogical spark of hope. The gentle soul who had courted her across 1,000 miles, the man who understood her grief and shared her dreams of the untamed frontier. He wasn't dead. He was outside, currently hammering extra nails into the barn doors to secure them against the incoming gale. But why the lie? Why present himself as a hired gun honoring a dead man's debt? Before she could march out into the freezing yard and demand the truth, the blizzard hit. It struck the valley with the concussive force of a cannon blast. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched, demonic howl that rattled the window panes in their frames and sent a spray of fine, icy powder down the chimney. The back door burst open. The wind threw it inward with a violent crash. Silas stumbled over the threshold, leaning his full weight against the heavy oak to force it shut against the gale. He threw the iron deadbolt, chest heaving, his broad shoulders coated in a thick layer of driving white snow. Evelyn swiftly hid the letters beneath her apron, standing up. Silas. He didn't look at her. He was shaking. Not a subtle tremble, but a deep, involuntary shudder that racked his massive frame. His skin, usually a sun-baked bronze, was an ashen, sickly gray. Barn roof is secure, he rasped out, his teeth chattering so hard the words barely formed. Stock has extra feed. I just need a blanket. Then I'm heading back out. He took a step toward the hallway closet, but his knee buckled. He caught himself heavily against the doorframe, a low groan escaping his throat as his right hand flew to clutch his left shoulder. You are not going back out there, Evelyn said, stepping forward, the anger over the letters momentarily eclipsed by pure alarm. It's 10 degrees below freezing and dropping. You'll die before you reach the barn. We had an agreement, he gritted out, trying to push off the wall. I don't stay in the house. To hell with the agreement, Silas. Look at you. She closed the distance between them, reaching out to grab his arm. The moment her hand touched his damp canvas sleeve, she felt the unnatural furnace-like heat radiating from his body. You're burning up with fever, she breathed, her eyes widening. Old wound, he muttered, his eyelids drooping. The deep cold, it wakes it up. I'll be fine. You are a terrible liar, Evelyn snapped, the double meaning of the words sharp on her tongue. She ducked under his good arm, wrapping hers around his waist to bear his weight. You are sleeping in the parlor. Now move. For once, the stubborn gunslinger didn't fight her. He couldn't. His strength was completely depleted. Together they hobbled into the small parlor. Silas collapsed onto the heavy fabric of the settee, his long legs spilling over the edge. Sit up, Evelyn ordered, her hands moving with efficient purpose. I have to get this wet coat off you. He complied sluggishly. As Evelyn peeled back the heavy canvas duster and then the dark Henley beneath it, her breath caught in her throat. His chest and arms were a map of violence. Thick, corded muscles were marred by old knife lines, but the source of his current agony was a massive, jagged starburst of scarred tissue high on his left pectoral, right above his heart. The flesh around the old bullet wound was angry, inflamed, and radiating heat. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, her fingers hovering a fraction of an inch above the ruined flesh. "A man who didn't shoot straight," Silas breathed. His eyes closed, his head resting back against the cushions. Evelyn swallowed hard. She unbuckled his heavy gun belt, feeling the symbolic weight of stripping away his lethal armor, and set the Colt .45 on the side table. She pulled a thick woolen quilt over his chest, then hurried to the kitchen to fetch a basin of cold water and a cloth. For the next 4 hours, the storm outside waged a relentless war against the cabin. The wind battered the log walls, shrieking through the eaves like a chorus of dying animals. But inside the dimly lit parlor, a different kind of storm raged. Silas was trapped in the suffocating grip of a fever dream. He thrashed under the quilt, his hands curling into fists, muttering broken, frantic words. "No, Arthur, wait. Don't let him see the ledger. Run!" Evelyn sat on the floor beside the settee, continually bathing his forehead and neck with the cold cloth. Every time he cried out, her heart cracked a little more. She had been so furious just hours ago, feeling like a fool played by a cruel trick. But looking at him now, stripped of his weapons, stripped of his stoic mask, she saw only a man carrying a crushing, unbearable guilt. "Evelyn," he suddenly gasped, his head rolling to the side. His hand shot out, his rough, burning fingers catching her wrist in a vice grip. His eyes were open but unseeing, clouded with fever. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I brought the devil to her door." "Hush, Silas," she murmured, using her free hand to stroke his thick, damp hair back from his forehead. The intimacy of the gesture felt entirely natural, despite the chaos of the day. "You're safe. I'm here." He slowly relaxed, his grip loosening, though he didn't let go of her hand. His breathing fell into a ragged, shallow rhythm. The silence in the parlor settled, broken only by the popping sap of the fireplace logs and the relentless howling of the blizzard outside. Evelyn felt the heavy weight of the letters resting in her apron pocket. The silence in the room felt too loud, too heavy with unspoken truths. Needing something to anchor her racing mind, she pulled the bundle free. She slipped out the blue ribbon and selected the third letter, the one that had made her fall in love. She needed to hear the words aloud. She needed to know if the beautiful soul on the paper could truly belong to the dangerous man lying beside her. Staring into the flickering firelight, Evelyn began to read, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the shrieking wind outside. "My dearest Evelyn, the winter here is bitter, but it is nothing compared to the cold of an empty room. I read your letters until the ink fades beneath my thumbs. You asked me once what I seek in the West. I seek a quiet dawn. I seek a place where a man is not measured by the sins of his past, but by the harvest of his future." She glanced down at Silas. He was perfectly still, his breathing steadying as if the cadence of her voice was a balm to his fevered mind. She looked back at the parchment, her eyes blurring with unshed tears. She reached the final paragraph, a passage of poetry he had included, one that she had read 100 times. "You are the tether that keeps me from drifting into the dark. And though the miles between us are vast..." Evelyn stopped. A tear slipped down her cheek, landing on the paper and blurring the ink. Her throat closed up. She tried to remember the rest of the stanza, the beautiful, heartbreaking conclusion to the verse, but the emotion choking her chest made her mind go blank. "And though the miles between us are vast," she whispered again, struggling to read the smeared ink in the dim light. From the deep shadows of the settee, a voice, rough like crushed gravel, heavy with exhaustion, but perfectly, flawlessly steady, spoke into the quiet room. "My soul has already crossed the plains, seeking the warmth of your Montana stars." Evelyn froze. The breath completely vanished from her lungs. She slowly turned her head. Silas's pale eyes were open, shining in the firelight. The fever glaze was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He wasn't looking at the ceiling or the fire. He was looking directly at her, his gaze locked onto her face with an intensity that made the world stop spinning. The howling of the blizzard outside seemed to fade into nothing. The room went dead, electrifyingly silent. He didn't need to look at the paper. He knew the words by heart, because they were his. The silence in the parlor was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed the breath right out of Evelyn's lungs. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the log walls, but inside, time had simply ceased to exist. Silas lay on the settee, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. His pale eyes, completely clear of the fever's haze, were locked onto hers with a devastating, naked honesty. The letter slipped from Evelyn's trembling fingers. It fluttered to the woven rug, landing inches from Silas's bare foot. "You," she whispered. The words scraped against her throat like dry glass. She stood up slowly, her knees weak, backing away from the settee, as if the man lying on it had suddenly turned into a coiled rattlesnake. "It was you." Silas didn't deny it. He didn't look away. With a grimace of pure agony, he planted his good arm against the cushions and forced himself into a sitting position. The quilt pooled around his waist, exposing the brutal scarring on his chest, but he ignored the pain. "Evie," he rasped, his voice raw. "Do not call me that," she shouted, the volume of her own voice shocking her. The nickname, the one Arthur had used in his most intimate letters, the one Silas had muttered in his fever dream, felt like a physical blow. "You lied to me. You stood on that train platform, looked me in the eye, and told me the man I had been writing to was dead." "He is dead, Evelyn," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly vibration. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. His broad shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. "Arthur Penhaligon died of a fever in St. Louis 2 weeks ago. That wasn't a lie." "But he didn't write those letters," she accused, pointing a shaking finger at the crumpled parchment on the floor. Her chest heaved. "You did. You poured out your soul. You promised me a future, and then you showed up here wearing a gun belt, pretending to be a stranger." "Arthur was an accountant," Silas began, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. "He was a wizard with numbers, but he couldn't string 2 words together to save his life. When he answered your advertisement, he asked me to help him draft the first reply. Just the one." Silas swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working. "But then you wrote back." Evelyn stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic, bruised rhythm. "You wrote about the mountains and your father and the loneliness that was eating you alive," Silas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He finally looked up, his pale eyes burning with a fierce, tragic intensity. "Arthur didn't understand it, but I did, so I wrote the second letter, and the third, until Arthur wasn't even reading them anymore. It was just me, sitting in a boarding house 1,000 miles away, pouring every piece of humanity I had left onto paper and sending it to a woman I had never met." A hot tear spilled over Evelyn's eyelashes. "Why didn't you tell me? When you arrived, why didn't you just tell me the truth?" "Look at me, Evelyn." Silas pushed himself to his feet. He swayed dangerously, his skin ashen, but he stood tall, casting a massive, imposing shadow against the firelit walls. He gestured to his heavily scarred chest, to the gun belt resting on the side table. "I am not a scholar. I am a man who has lived by the gun since I was 15 years old. I have blood on my hands that will never wash off. You asked for a partner to build a quiet life. You didn't ask for a killer." "I asked for the man who wrote those letters," she cried out, her voice breaking. "And he is standing right in front of me, playing the coward." Silas flinched as if she had struck him. He took a slow, painful step toward her. "I came here to protect you. That was the only truth that mattered. Arthur didn't just die of a fever, Evelyn. He was running. He found a ledger. Evelyn frowned, the sudden shift in his tone pulling her out of her heartbreak and into a cold, sharp reality. A ledger? Arthur kept the books for a railroad baron in Kansas named Harlan Thorne, a man they call Blackjack. Silas's eyes darkened, the lethal gunslinger returning to the surface. Thorne was moving his operation to Montana. Arthur found proof that Thorne was systematically running homesteaders off their land, bribing judges and murdering anyone who wouldn't sell. Arthur stole the ledger to take it to the federal marshals. Thorne's men caught up with us in St. Louis. Arthur caught a bullet in the gut. The fever finished him a week later. Evelyn's breath hitched. Silas, you're a wanted man. I brought the ledger here, Silas admitted, his voice hollow. I thought if I could just get to you, keep the bank off your back, I could hide the ledger, secure your deed, and then draw Thorne's men away. I thought your debt to the bank was just bad luck. He took another step closer, until he was close enough that Evelyn could feel the unnatural heat radiating from his feverish skin. He looked down at her, his expression twisting into a mask of pure self-loathing horror. But I was wrong. I looked at your deed last night, Evelyn. I looked at the surveyor's map. Silas raised his hands, then dropped them helplessly. Josiah Crane doesn't work for the bank. He works for Thorne. The new railroad line has to pass through this valley, and steam engines need water. Your property sits directly on top of the only underground aquifer for 50 miles. The air in the parlor turned to ice. Evelyn stared at him, her mind racing, connecting the terrifying dots. Her father's sudden fatal accident with a spooked horse, the bank calling in the loan 6 months early, Crane's smug confidence on the train platform. They didn't want my father's money, she whispered, the blood draining from her face. They wanted the land. Thorne isn't just hunting me, Evie, Silas said, his voice cracking with desperation. He's coming for this ranch, and by bringing that ledger here, I just gave him the excuse he needs to burn this place to the ground and kill everyone inside it. I brought the devil right to your front door. Evelyn stared at the tall, dangerous, deeply broken man standing before her. The betrayal of the letters, the terror of the railroad baron, the realization that her father might have been murdered. It all crashed over her in a violent, overwhelming tidal wave. She reacted purely on instinct. Her hand flew up. With all the strength in her body, she slapped him across the face. The sharp crack of her palm against his jaw echoed like a gunshot in the small room. Silas's head snapped to the side. He didn't make a sound. He didn't even raise a hand to his rapidly reddening cheek. He just slowly turned his head back to face her, accepting the blow as if he believed he deserved 100 more. "How dare you?" Evelyn hissed, her chest heaving, tears of absolute fury and terror streaming down her face. "How dare you make my choices for me? How dare you make me fall in love with a ghost?" She raised her hand to hit him again. This time, Silas moved. With the blurring speed of a gunfighter, his hand shot out and caught her wrist mid-air. His grip was incredibly strong but completely devoid of cruelty. He pulled her wrist downward, using the momentum to step directly into her space. The sudden, forceful proximity knocked the breath out of her. Their bodies collided, his bare, fever-hot chest pressing against the cold wool of her dress. Evelyn gasped, looking up into his eyes. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm raging in Silas Vance's pale irises. The stoic, untouchable gunslinger was gone. In his place was a man violently, desperately in love, standing on the edge of the abyss. "I'm sorry," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper against her lips. "God, Evelyn, I'm so sorry." The tension that had been building between them since the moment he stepped off the train finally, irrevocably snapped. Silas released her wrist and buried both his rough hands into her auburn hair, tilting her face up. He didn't ask for permission, and Evelyn didn't offer a denial. He crashed his mouth down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of tears, fever, and raw, unfiltered need. Evelyn let out a muffled sob against his lips, her hands flying up. For a second she meant to push his chest away, to fight the overwhelming gravity of him. Instead, her fingers curled into the hard muscles of his shoulders, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with equal, terrifying ferocity. The world outside the cabin vanished, leaving only the heat of his mouth, the frantic beating of his heart against hers, and the shocking, undeniable truth that the man she had loved in the letters and the dangerous cowboy holding her in the dark were, finally, one and the same. The kiss was a collision of desperate, ragged truths. It tasted of wood smoke, the bitter edge of Silas's fever, and the salt of Evelyn's tears. For a suspended eternity, the howling of the Montana blizzard was silenced by the roaring in Evelyn's ears. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the hard, corded muscles of his shoulders, feeling the erratic, heavy thud of his heart against her own. Silas's large hands framed her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a frantic, trembling reverence, as if he expected her to shatter, or worse, to vanish. It was not the gentle, polite embrace she had once imagined sharing with a soft-spoken accountant. It was untamed. It was a claiming, a physical manifestation of every word he had poured onto parchment over the last 6 months. But as suddenly as the storm between them had broken, the brutal reality of their situation crashed back in. Silas tore himself away. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in harsh, tearing gasps. The sudden absence of his heat left Evelyn shivering, her lips parted and swollen, her chest heaving. Silas hit the edge of the heavy oak table, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned stark white. His chest, marred by the jagged starburst of his old wound, rose and fell rapidly. He looked at her not with the triumph of a lover, but with the profound, sickening horror of a man who had just committed a fatal sin. "I shouldn't have done that," he choked out, his voice a gravelly rasp. He closed his eyes, turning his face away from her, as if the sight of her was too bright, too pure for him to bear. "God forgive me. I had no right." "Silas." Evelyn took a step toward him, her hand outstretched, her mind still reeling from the electrifying shock of his mouth on hers. The anger over the deception was completely eclipsed by the terrifying depth of the connection they had just forged. "Don't," he commanded, throwing a hand up to stop her. His pale eyes snapped open, burning with a mix of fever and intense self-loathing. "Don't come closer, Evelyn. I brought a death sentence to your front door. I lied to you. I let you believe in a ghost because I was too much of a coward to face the fact that a man like me has no business touching a woman like you." "You wrote those letters," she countered, her voice trembling but finding its steel. "You gave me hope when I was drowning in grief. You stood between me and Josiah Crane. You did not act like a coward." "I am a killer, Evelyn." The shout tore from his throat, echoing violently in the small, dim parlor. He grabbed his heavy canvas duster from the back of a chair, shrugging into it despite his fever, hiding the scars, hiding himself. "Arthur was the good man. I am just the gun he hired when things went to hell. Thorne isn't going to send negotiators. He's going to send men who burn ranches to the ground with the doors locked from the outside. If I stay here, if I let myself have this, have you, it will be the reason you die." He didn't wait for her to respond. He couldn't. Silas turned and staggered toward the back door, his fever making his movements uncoordinated, heavy. He threw the deadbolt and shoved the door open. The blizzard immediately screamed into the kitchen, a chaotic swirl of blinding white snow and freezing wind. "Silas, stop! You'll freeze!" she screamed over the gale, running toward him. But he was already gone, pulling the door shut behind him with a resounding slam, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the sudden, echoing quiet of the cabin. She rushed to the frosted window, wiping a circle clear with the heel of her hand. Through the driving snow, she saw his dark silhouette push against the wind, a solitary shadow disappearing into the pitch-black maw of the barn. Evelyn slowly slid down the wall until she hit the floorboards, pulling her knees to her chest. The heavy iron ring on her left hand felt cold against her skin. She sat there in the dark, the dying embers of the hearth casting long, flickering shadows across the room, and for the first time since her father died, she did not cry. The tears were gone. In their place, a slow, deep, and terrifyingly cold resolve began to solidify. By dawn, the wind had finally exhausted itself. Evelyn awoke stiff and aching, having fallen asleep wrapped in a quilt on the parlor floor. The silence in the cabin was absolute, heavy, and thick. It was the specific, muffled quiet that only comes after a massive snowfall. She stood up, pulling her shawl tight. The fire had died to gray ash. The air inside was bitter, her breath pluming in small white clouds. She walked to the window. The Montana landscape had been transformed into an ocean of blinding, pristine white. The snowdrifts were chest-high in some places, burying the fences and softening the harsh edges of the world. The barn doors were shut tight. No smoke rose from the small tin chimney of the tack room. A spike of pure panic drove through Evelyn's heart. He's dead. The fever took him in the night. She turned on her heel to grab her boots, but stopped dead in her tracks when she reached the kitchen table. Sitting in the exact center of the scarred oak surface, illuminated by the pale morning light streaming through the frost-rimmed glass, was a thick, leather-bound book. It hadn't been there last night. Evelyn approached it slowly, as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. It was an accounting ledger, the dark brown leather worn soft at the corners from heavy use. Resting on top of the ledger was a single sheet of paper folded once. She picked up the note. The handwriting was unmistakable, the elegant sweeping script that had anchored her soul for half a year. But the words were not poetry. They were a confession and a goodbye. Evelyn, by the time you read this, the storm will have broken, and I will be gone. I took the fever tonic from your cabinet. It broke the worst of the heat. I have enough strength to ride. I am leaving the ledger with you. Hide it beneath the floorboards. Do not tell the sheriff. Do not tell anyone in Oakhaven you have it. Crane owns the town, but he doesn't know for certain the book made it to Montana. If I ride out, visible and loud, they will track me. I will draw Thorne's men north into the mountains. They will follow the gun, not the girl. This book is Arthur's legacy. It contains every bribe, every stolen deed, and every drop of blood Harlan Thorne has spilled to build his railroad. Look at page 42. You need to know the truth of what you are fighting for. I am leaving you, the ranch, the deed, and my name as a shield. But I cannot leave you my presence. You asked for a sunrise, Evie. I am only capable of bringing the night. Forgive me for the letters, but know that every word I wrote to you was the only honest thing I have ever done. S. Vance. Evelyn stared at the paper, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. He was leaving. He was riding out into 3 feet of snow, still recovering from a devastating fever, to act as human bait. He was going to sacrifice himself to pull the wolves away from her door. You absolute stubborn fool, she whispered, her voice cracking. She set the letter down and pulled the heavy leather ledger toward her. Her fingers trembled as she unfastened the brass clasp. The pages were filled with meticulous, perfectly aligned columns of numbers, dates, and names. It was the work of a brilliant accountant, detailing a massive, terrifying empire of corruption. She turned the heavy pages until she reached page 42. The ink here was different, written with a heavier, more hurried hand, as if Arthur had been terrified while recording it. It was a log of properties situated in the Oakhaven Valley. Evelyn scanned the list. Her eyes stopped on a line halfway down the page. The breath left her lungs in a painful rush. Property 14, Montgomery Ranch, 160 acres. Primary aquifer access. Status, owner resistant. Action taken, October 12th. Incident orchestrated, paid J. Miller $50 to spook the herd during canyon transit. Owner deceased. Foreclosure proceedings initiated via J. Crane. Evelyn stared at the ink until the letters blurred into meaningless black shapes. Incident orchestrated. Her father hadn't died in a tragic accident. He hadn't just fallen under the hooves of a panicked herd. He had been murdered. Murdered for water. Murdered for a line on a map by a man sitting in a comfortable office hundreds of miles away. A low, guttural sound escaped Evelyn's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. The grief that had been a dull, heavy ache in her chest for 6 months suddenly ignited into a roaring, blinding inferno. She slammed the ledger shut. Silas thought he could ride away. He thought he could take the target off her back by becoming a martyr in the snow. He thought she was a fragile, delicate thing that needed to be shielded from the darkness of the world. He was wrong. Evelyn didn't reach for her shawl. She didn't reach for her coat. She walked directly to the heavy gun cabinet in the corner of the parlor. She retrieved her father's Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. It was a beautiful, deadly piece of machinery, the walnut stock polished smooth by her father's hands. She grabbed a handful of heavy .44-40 cartridges from the brass tin on the shelf, shoving them deep into her apron pocket. She marched to the back door, threw the deadbolt, and kicked the door open. The glare of the morning sun on the fresh snow was blinding. The cold bit into her face like a swarm of angry hornets, but Evelyn didn't feel it. She stepped off the porch, her boots sinking knee-deep into the pristine, powdery drifts. She waded through the snow toward the barn, the heavy Winchester gripped tightly in her right hand. As she neared the heavy wooden doors, she heard the muffled snort of a horse and the creak of saddle leather. He was already mounting up, ready mounting. Evelyn grabbed the iron handle of the barn door and hauled it back with all the furious strength she possessed. The door slid open on its frozen iron track with a shrieking grind. Inside the dim, hay-scented interior, Silas froze. He was sitting atop his massive black gelding. He had his heavy duster collar turned up against the cold, a woolen scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face. His saddlebags were packed tight. He looked like a grim reaper preparing to ride into the apocalypse. His pale eyes widened in shock as he looked down at Evelyn. She stood in the doorway, framed by the blinding white snow, her auburn hair falling in wild disarray around her shoulders, her jaw set like carved granite. And in her hands, she held the Winchester rifle, aimed not at the ground, but angled up, her finger resting dangerously close to the trigger guard. "Evelyn," Silas said, his voice muffled by the scarf. He pulled it down, his brow furrowing in confusion and alarm. "What the hell are you doing? Put the rifle down before you hurt yourself." Evelyn didn't lower the barrel an inch. With a swift, practiced motion, she flicked her wrist, racking the lever of the Winchester. Clack, clack. A heavy brass cartridge chambered with a metallic finality. The sound echoed in the cavernous space of the barn, an eerie, deliberate mirror to the exact motion Silas had used to intimidate the banker on the train platform just 48 hours ago. Silas's jaw dropped slightly. The horse shifted uneasily beneath him, sensing the sudden, lethal tension in the air. "Get off the horse, Silas," Evelyn commanded. Her voice did not shake. It rang out clear and sharp as a cracking whip. "Evelyn, you read the letter. You know why I have to go." Silas shifted his weight in the saddle, his eyes darting to the rifle, calculating if he could dismount before she did something reckless. "Thorne's men." "I read the ledger," Evelyn shouted, cutting him off. Her voice echoed off the high rafters. "I read page 42. I saw my father's name." Silas went entirely still, the grim determination on his face fractured, replaced by a deep, hollow sorrow. "Evie, I didn't want you to see that. I'm so sorry. Do not apologize to me. Do not patronize me." She took a step into the barn, her boots crunching on the loose hay. "They murdered him, Silas. They slaughtered my father for dirt and water, and they thought they could just forge some papers and sweep us away like dust." "Which is exactly why I am leaving," Silas urged, his voice desperate. He leaned forward over the saddle horn. "If I ride north, I take Thorne's crosshairs with me. They want the ledger, and they want my head. If I am gone, Crane has no legal leg to stand on to take this property. You will be safe." "Safe?" Evelyn let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. "You think I give a damn about being safe while the men who murdered my father are hunting my husband in the mountains?" The word hung in the freezing air between them. Husband. Silas flinched, his knuckles turning white on the leather reins. "I am not your husband, not really. I'm a hired gun who forged a signature." "You are a liar," Evelyn stated coldly. "But you didn't lie in those letters. I know it. You know it. You poured your soul onto those pages, Silas Vance. You told me you wanted a quiet dawn. You told me you wanted a place where a man wasn't measured by his sins." "And I was a fool to think I could have it," Silas roared back, the composure finally breaking. He swung his long leg over the saddle and dropped to the dirt floor of the barn. He didn't approach her, keeping his distance, pacing like a caged wolf. "Look at me, Evelyn. Look at the blood on my hands. I am a magnet for death. Everywhere I go, people die. Arthur died. If I stay here, Thorne will send an army. They will burn this beautiful house to the ground, and they will kill you just to get to me. Then we will kill them first." The absolute chilling certainty in her voice stopped Silas in his tracks. He stared at her, his pale eyes wide, seeing her truly for the first time. She wasn't the fragile, grieving woman from the letters. She was a daughter of the Montana frontier, forged in the same brutal fires of survival that he was. "You think you can just ride out and make my choices for me?" Evelyn demanded, taking another step forward, finally lowering the barrel of the Winchester so it pointed at the dirt. "You think you get to decide how this ends? You think your guilt is heavier than my right to defend my home?" "I am trying to save your life," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I don't need you to save my life, Silas," she yelled back, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "I need you to stand beside me while I fight for it. This is my land. This is my father's blood in this soil. If Harlan Thorne wants it, he is going to have to walk through hell to get it. And I am not fighting that war alone." Silas stared at her, his chest heaving, the breath pluming in the freezing air between them. He looked at the fierce, beautiful, terrifying woman standing in the doorway of the barn, and he felt the last stubborn walls around his heart begin to crumble into dust. "Evie," he whispered, shaking his head. "They have dozens of men. Killers, trackers, men who don't hesitate." "I have a Winchester," Evelyn replied flatly. "And I have you. Unless the man who wrote those letters is a coward. Unless the man who kissed me last night is going to turn his back and run when the fight actually matters." It was a deliberate, calculated strike to his pride, and it hit with the force of a sledgehammer. Silas's jaw locked. He took a slow, measured step toward her, then another. He didn't stop until he was standing less than a foot away, towering over her. The heat radiating from his body was a sharp contrast to the bitter cold. He looked down into her fierce, tear-bright eyes. "I have never run from a fight in my life," he said softly, the lethal, quiet edge returning to his voice. "Then don't start now." Evelyn didn't back down. She tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze head-on. "Stay. Stay here. Not as Arthur's replacement. Not to pay off a debt. Stay because this is our home, and we are not going to let them take it." Silas looked at her. He saw the iron in her spine, the fire in her soul. He realized with a profound, earth-shattering clarity that he had spent his entire life wandering the frontier, searching for something worth dying for. He had been wrong. He hadn't needed something to die for. He had needed someone to live for. Slowly, Silas reached out. His large, rough hand wrapped around the cold steel barrel of the Winchester, gently pushing it entirely aside. He stepped into her space, closing the final few inches between them. He raised his free hand, his calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed away a solitary tear that had escaped to freeze on her cheek. "If I stay," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, absolute promise, "there is no going back. I will turn this ranch into a fortress. I will teach you how to shoot to kill, not just to spook. I will do things, brutal, unforgivable things, to anyone who tries to cross that property line. I will become the monster they think I am, Evelyn, to keep you safe." "I don't want a saint, Silas," Evelyn whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs, her own hand coming up to rest flat against his broad chest, right over his beating heart. "I want my husband." The word hit him like a physical impact. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. When he opened them again, the ghost of the lonely, wandering gunfighter was gone. In his place was a man who had finally found his anchor. "All right," Silas breathed, leaning his forehead down to rest against hers. "All right, we stand. We fight them together." Evelyn closed her eyes, a profound wave of relief and terrifying anticipation washing over her. She leaned into his strength, inhaling the scent of him, feeling the solid, immovable reality of the man who had chosen her over his own salvation. They stood there in the doorway of the barn, the pristine white snow stretching out behind them, a silent pact forged in the freezing Montana air. It was a moment of perfect, fragile peace. It lasted exactly 10 seconds. The sound was distant, muffled by the heavy blanket of snow that covered the valley. But to ears trained for violence, it was unmistakable. Crack! It was the sharp, flat report of a high-caliber rifle echoing off the distant eastern ridge. Before Evelyn could even process the sound, Silas reacted. The tender, vulnerable man vanished instantly, replaced by the apex predator. He didn't flinch. He moved. His arm whipped around Evelyn's waist, hauling her bodily out of the open doorway and dragging her behind the thick, solid timber frame of the barn wall. In the same fluid motion, his right hand blurred downward. The heavy Colt .45 was out of its holster and cocked before Evelyn even realized he had drawn it. The massive black gelding tied in the center of the barn let out a shrill, panicked whinny, rearing up and striking its front hooves against the dirt. "Silas!" Evelyn gasped, her back pressed hard against the rough wood, her heart rocketing into her throat. She fumbled to bring her Winchester up, her hands suddenly slick with nervous sweat. What was that? Was it a hunter? "Hunters don't shoot in the aftermath of a blizzard when the game is bedded down," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. He didn't look at her. His pale eyes were slitted, focused intensely on the eastern tree line, visible through a small crack between the barn boards. His thumb rested lightly on the hammer of his revolver. "Is it Thorn?" she asked, the reality of their pact suddenly crashing down on her with the weight of an avalanche. "Thorn wouldn't announce himself with a single shot from a mile out," Silas muttered, his mind working rapidly, analyzing the tactical geometry of the valley. "That was a warning shot. Or a signal. A signal to who? To us. Or to the rest of his men?" Silas's eyes narrowed further. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out the silver pocket watch. He checked the time with a quick, practiced glance, snapping it shut. The storm broke 2 hours ago. The roads from Oakhaven are impassable for wagons, but a man on horseback pushing hard could have made it here. He turned to Evelyn, his expression carved from stone. "Stay here. Do not move from this wall. Keep the rifle aimed at the doorway. If anything steps through that isn't me, you pull that trigger and you keep pulling it until it stops moving. Do you understand me?" "Where are you going?" Panic spiked in her chest. "I'm going to find out what died on our property line." Without waiting for a response, Silas slipped out the back of the barn, disappearing into the shadows and the deep snow with the terrifying silence of a ghost. Evelyn stood frozen against the wall, her knuckles white on the grip of the Winchester. The minutes stretched out into an agonizing, suffocating eternity. The silence of the snow, which had seemed so peaceful an hour ago, now felt thick and malicious, hiding unseen terrors. She strained her ears, listening for another gunshot, for the crunch of boots in the snow, for Silas's voice. Nothing. Only the nervous shifting of the gelding in the stall behind her. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been 10 minutes, a low whistle cut through the air. 2 short bursts, 1 long. It was the signal Silas had told her he would use. Evelyn exhaled a shaky breath, lowering the rifle slightly, and crept to the edge of the barn door, peering out into the blinding white yard. Silas was walking back toward the barn. He wasn't running, but his stride was long and purposeful. As he drew closer, Evelyn saw that his face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. In his left hand, he was dragging something through the snow. Evelyn stepped out into the light, her stomach turning to ice as she realized what it was. It was a saddle, a heavy Western-style saddle, the leather dark and wet. But it wasn't just wet with melted snow. It was smeared with a thick, vivid streak of crimson blood, stark and horrifying, against the pristine white powder covering the yard. Silas reached the barn and threw the heavy saddle onto the dirt floor with a heavy, wet thud. Evelyn stared at it, her hand flying to her mouth. "Silas, what happened? Who is out there?" "A scout," Silas said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He holstered his revolver, his eyes scanning the horizon line above the trees. He was posted on the ridge, watching the house. He tried to ride his horse down the steep embankment to get a closer look. The horse lost its footing in a hidden drift and rolled over him. Is he dead?" "Neck snapped," Silas replied bluntly. "The gunshot we heard was his rifle going off when the horse crushed him. The horse bolted back toward Oakhaven." Evelyn stared at the bloody saddle, the reality of the violence violently intruding upon her home. "If the horse bolted back to town, Thorne will see the blood on the empty saddle," Silas finished the thought, his pale eyes meeting hers with absolute, terrifying clarity. "He'll know his scout is dead. He'll assume I killed him. He won't wait for the snow to melt. He won't send negotiators." Silas reached down, unbuckling a small leather pouch attached to the side of the bloody saddle. He tossed it onto the workbench. It hit with a heavy metallic clink. It was filled with extra ammunition, enough for a small war. "The choice to run is gone, Evelyn," Silas said, stepping close to her, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that resonated in her chest. He reached out, his warm hands gripping her shoulders, grounding her in the terrifying reality of the moment. "They know we're here, they know we have the ledger, and now they think we've drawn first blood." Evelyn looked from the bloody saddle to the lethal, determined face of the man she had just bound her soul to. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it the steel of her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She tightened her grip on the Winchester. "Then let them come," Evelyn whispered. Silas's eyes flashed with a dark, fierce pride. He pulled his silver pocket watch from his vest, flicking it open. The heavy tick-tick-tick filled the silence. "It's 9 in the morning," Silas stated, snapping the silver case shut with a sharp final clack. "We have until nightfall to turn this ranch into a slaughterhouse." The transition from a home into a fortress is not a quiet affair. It is a violent, destructive process that requires the systematic dismantling of comfort in the name of survival. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the Montgomery ranch echoed with the harsh, staccato rhythm of impending war. The heavy, rhythmic thud-crack of Silas's axe biting into timber rang out across the frozen yard. He was not chopping down the oak tree. Instead, he was tearing apart the heavy wooden corral fencing, carrying the thick beams into the house to barricade the lower floor windows. Evelyn stood in the center of the parlor, her skirts tied up, her hands blistered and raw. The delicate lace curtains her mother had sewn were ripped down and shoved into a trunk. In their place, Silas was driving iron spikes through the thick corral beams, securing them across the glass. He left only narrow horizontal gaps, loopholes he called them, just wide enough to slide the barrel of a Winchester through, but narrow enough to stop incoming lead. "They won't ride straight up the main road," Silas said, his voice grunting with exertion as he drove a 5-inch spike into the window frame with a heavy iron mallet. Whack! Whack! "Thorne's men are wolves, Evelyn. They hunt in a pack. They'll fan out, use the tree line for cover, and try to encircle the house." Evelyn picked up a heavy wooden chair and wedged it under the brass handle of the front door, reinforcing the deadbolt. "Then we don't let them encircle us. We funnel them." Silas paused, the mallet resting against his thigh. He wiped a streak of sweat and sawdust from his forehead, his pale eyes narrowing. Funnel them how? My father bought this land because of the water, but he built the house where he did because of the geography, Evelyn explained, walking over to the dining table. She grabbed a piece of charcoal and sketched a rough map on the back of an old ledger page. The western side of the house backs up to a steep, rocky ravine. You can't ride a horse up it, and a man on foot would have to climb hand over hand. They won't attack from the west. Silas walked over, his heavy boots thumping against the floorboards. He leaned over the table, his broad chest brushing against her shoulder. The heat of him was a stark contrast to the freezing draft coming through the floorboards. That leaves the north, the south, and the east. The south is the main road, Evelyn said, tapping the charcoal. But the east is the creek crossing. The water is shallow, but the banks are steep clay. There's only one natural ramp up to the yard. If they want to flank us from the trees, they have to cross that ramp. Silas looked at the crude map, then turned his gaze to Evelyn. The dark, lethal intensity in his eyes softened into a profound, terrifying awe. You want to trap the ramp. My father trapped wolves, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a cold, hard register she barely recognized as her own. She turned to face him, her chin tilted up. In the root cellar, there are 6 iron bear traps. The heavy ones, with the double-coiled springs and teeth that can shatter a femur. There is also a spool of rusted barbed wire he never got around to using for the upper pasture. Silas stared at her. For a long, silent moment, the only sound in the house was the distant howling of the wind over the roof. You string that wire at neck height across the southern tree line, Silas murmured, his mind instantly grasping the brutal geometry of her plan. A rider coming in fast under the cover of darkness won't see it until it rips him out of the saddle. And the bear traps go in the mud at the top of the eastern creek ramp, Evelyn finished. They step off the bank. They lose a leg. We force them into the open yard. We make them fight us where we can see them. Silas let out a low, rough exhale. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a smudge of charcoal from her cheek. The touch was achingly tender, a stark contrast to the horrific violence they were discussing. You are a terrifying woman, Evelyn Vance. The use of her married name sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I am a woman defending her home, Silas. I will not be a victim. No, he agreed softly, his thumb lingering on her jawline. You won't. I won't let you be. The moment hung suspended, heavy with the unspoken weight of their confession from the morning. But the ticking clock of survival allowed no time for romance. Silas dropped his hand, the hardened tactician returning. Go get the wire and the traps. I'll finish barricading the north windows, then we move outside. By early afternoon, the weather began to turn. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a localized phenomenon the natives called a chinook, a sudden, dramatic warming of the air blowing over the mountains. The temperature climbed 20 degrees in the span of an hour. The pristine 3-foot drifts of snow began to melt with catastrophic speed. The frozen ground beneath could not absorb the water fast enough. Within 2 hours, the Montgomery Ranch was transformed into a treacherous, freezing nightmare of deep, sucking mud and slush. And then the sky opened up. It opened. It didn't snow. It rained. A torrential, freezing downpour that battered the earth, turning the yard into a slick, brown battlefield. Evelyn was soaked to the bone. Her heavy wool dress dragged in the mud as she stood at the top of the creek ramp, struggling with the iron jaws of a massive bear trap. Her hands were numb, her fingers slipping on the wet, rusted metal. Silas materialized beside her through the sheets of rain. He wore his canvas duster, the heavy fabric turning dark and stiff with the water. Let me, he grunted, dropping to one knee in the mud. He gripped the heavy iron springs with both hands, his broad shoulders bunching with effort. With a low growl, he forced the massive, serrated jaws apart, locking the trigger pan into place. He lowered the trap carefully into the deep, sloughing mud, then covered the iron mechanism with a layer of dead wet leaves and slush. It became entirely invisible. "That's 5, Silas yelled over the roar of the rain and the rushing creek. "The ramp is impassable." "The wire is strung on the south line," Evelyn shouted back, her teeth chattering. She wiped the freezing rain from her eyes. "If they ride through those trees, they'll be decapitated." Silas grabbed her arm, hauling her up from the mud. "Then we're done out here. Inside. Now." They stumbled back to the house, slipping and sliding in the treacherous muck. Silas threw the heavy oak door shut behind them, slamming the reinforced crossbar into its iron brackets with a deafening thwack. The interior of the house was pitch black, the boarded-up windows blocking all natural light. Silas struck a match, his hands shaking slightly from the cold, and lit the kerosene lamp on the dining table. The yellow glow revealed 2 people who looked like they had crawled out of a grave. They were coated in freezing mud, shivering violently, their chests heaving. But there was no time to rest. Silas stripped off his dripping duster, throwing it onto the floor. He walked over to the table and picked up Evelyn's Winchester. "Take off your wet coat and come here," he ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. Evelyn shivered, peeling off her soaked outer layer, leaving her in a damp white blouse and a mud-stained skirt. She walked to the table. Silas ejected the rounds from the Winchester, catching the brass cartridges in his hand. He placed the empty rifle on the table in front of her. Then he dumped a handful of heavy .44-40 cartridges next to it. "Load it," he commanded. Evelyn frowned, her fingers stiff and numb. She picked up a cartridge and fumbled with the loading gate on the side of the receiver, pushing the bullet in. It took her 3 seconds. She reached for another. "Too slow," Silas barked. He reached out and knocked the cartridge from her fingers. It clattered to the floorboards. Evelyn glared at him. "My hands are freezing, Silas." "When Thorne's men kick that door down, your hands will be shaking worse than they are now," he said, his pale eyes completely devoid of sympathy. He stepped behind her, his large, solid chest pressing against her back. He reached around her, his rough, calloused hands covering hers. "You don't look at the gun," he murmured, his voice suddenly a low vibration against her ear. The heat of his body was intoxicating, a stark contrast to his harsh words. "You keep your eyes on the door. You let your fingers feel the brass. You find the gate, and you push it until you hear the click. Let muscle memory take over." He guided her hands. She picked up a cartridge without looking. With his hands over hers, she slid the bullet into the loading gate. Click. "Again," he whispered. Click. Again. He stepped away, removing the warmth of his body. "Now, do it alone." For the next hour, Silas ran her through a brutal, unforgiving drill. He made her load the rifle, rack the lever, and dry fire at shadows in the room. He yelled at her, simulated the sounds of breaking glass, banged the table with his fists to startle her, doing everything in his power to induce panic. Evelyn's fingers bled. The sharp edges of the loading gate sliced into her numb skin, smearing the brass cartridges with red. Her arms ached and her shoulders burned. "I'm out!" she yelled, pulling the trigger on an empty chamber. "Then you're dead," Silas roared, slamming his hand on the table. "You count your shots, Evelyn. The Winchester holds 15. When you hit 12, you start backing toward the root cellar. You never run it dry. Never!" "I am trying!" she screamed back, slamming the rifle down onto the table. Tears of frustration and exhaustion finally spilled over, mixing with the rain and mud on her face. "I am not a killer, Silas. I don't know how to do this." The echo of her shout faded into the heavy drumming of the rain on the roof. Silas stared at her. The harsh, tyrannical drill instructor vanished. His broad chest heaved, his eyes dropping to her bleeding, trembling hands. He cursed softly under his breath. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling a clean cotton cloth from the wash basin. He stepped up to her and gently, reverently, took her bleeding hands in his. "I know," he whispered, his voice cracking with a devastating tenderness. He carefully wiped the blood and mud from her fingers, his touch so light it was a stark contrast to the violence he had just been simulating. "I know you're not a killer, Evie. God knows I never wanted this for you. I wanted to be your shield. I wanted to stand in the doorway and take the bullets so you would never have to touch a gun." He raised her battered hands, pressing his lips gently to her bruised knuckles. "But there are too many of them," he confessed, the terrible truth hanging in the dim light. He looked up, his pale eyes bright with unshed tears. "If I fall, if they get past me, you have to know how to finish it. You have to survive, because if they touch you, Evelyn, if I die knowing they got to you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The absolute horror in his eyes told her everything. He wasn't drilling her out of cruelty. He was drilling her out of a profound, desperate love. Evelyn pulled her hands free, reaching up to frame his rough, unshaven face. "You are not going to fall," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, unwavering whisper. "We are going to fight them. And when the sun comes up tomorrow, we are going to be the only ones left standing. Do you hear me?" Silas looked down at her, the distance between them vanishing into nothing. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his hands coming up to grip her waist, pulling her flush against him. "I hear you," he murmured. He didn't need to say anything else. The look in his eyes, a mixture of agonizing fear and a consuming fiery devotion, was louder than a gunshot. By late afternoon, the house was fully secured. Every window was boarded. Every weapon was loaded and staged at strategic points around the parlor and the kitchen. The rain continued to pound against the roof, a relentless, deafening drumbeat that completely isolated them from the outside world. The cabin was a sealed tomb, smelling of damp wool, kerosene, and the sharp metallic tang of gun oil. Evelyn stood by the cast-iron stove in the kitchen, boiling a pot of water. She had managed to strip off her muddy clothes, changing into a simple, clean white cotton nightgown and a heavy wool cardigan. Silas emerged from the shadows of the hallway. He had stripped to the waist, using a rough towel to wipe the freezing mud and sweat from his torso. Evelyn turned, handing him a mug of black coffee. Her eyes inevitably dropped to his chest. Without the heavy canvas duster or the gun belt, he looked breathtakingly vulnerable. The map of scars across his skin told the story of a man who had survived 100 violent encounters. But the massive, jagged starburst over his heart was the most terrifying. Silas noticed her staring. He didn't cover up. He took the coffee, his pale eyes holding hers over the rim of the tin mug. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, stepping closer. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice low. "The cold makes it ache, but the pain is a reminder." "A reminder of what?" "That I didn't die when I was supposed to," he said, taking a slow sip. He set the mug down on the counter. "I was 22 when I took that bullet. A dispute over a rigged card game in Deadwood. I bled out on the floor of a saloon. The doctor told me I was dead. I woke up 3 days later." He looked down at the scar, his jaw tightening. "For 10 years I wondered why. Why the devil sent me back. I spent a decade drifting, pulling a trigger for men who paid in gold, waiting for a bullet that would finally finish the job. I thought my life was just a delayed sentence." Silas raised his eyes, looking at Evelyn. The yellow light of the kerosene lamp caught the profound, shifting emotion in his gaze. "Then Arthur asked me to write a letter," Silas whispered. "And you wrote back." He took a step toward her, the space between them narrowing until Evelyn could feel the ambient heat of his bare chest. "I don't want to die anymore, Evelyn," he confessed, the words tearing out of his throat, raw and bleeding. "For the first time in my miserable life, I am terrified of the dark. I'm terrified of tomorrow, because tomorrow I might lose the only sunrise I've ever cared about." Evelyn's breath hitched. A solitary tear spilled down her cheek, hot and fast. She didn't speak. Words were too small, too fragile for the sheer weight of what hung between them. The violence, the fear, the impending siege, it all fell away, leaving only the devastating, beautiful truth of this man. Evelyn reached out. Her trembling fingers brushed against the hard, scarred plane of his chest. Silas sucked in a sharp breath as her fingertips traced the jagged edges of the bullet wound over his heart. He didn't flinch away. He leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut, a low groan vibrating in the back of his throat. Evelyn stepped fully into his space, sliding her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his bare chest. She could hear the heavy, frantic thud of his heart beneath the scar tissue. It beat for her. It had always beat for her. Silas's arms came around her, crushing her to him with a desperate, crushing strength. He buried his face in her auburn hair, inhaling the scent of her like a drowning man taking his last breath of air. He kissed the top of her head, then her temple, his lips rough and urgent. Evelyn tilted her head back, meeting his mouth. The kiss was not like the explosive, furious collision of the morning. This was slow. It was reverent. It was a profound, aching surrender. Silas's large hands moved down her back, tracing the curve of her spine through the heavy wool cardigan. He pulled away slightly, his pale eyes searching hers, asking a silent, agonizing question. "Are you sure?" Evelyn answered by reaching up and sliding the cardigan off her shoulders. It dropped to the floorboards. Silas let out a ragged breath. He scooped her up into his arms in one fluid, powerful motion. Evelyn gasped, her arms wrapping tight around his neck. He carried her down the short, dark hallway to her bedroom, kicking the door shut behind them. The room was illuminated only by the faint, flickering light of a single candle on the nightstand. The storm outside raged on, the rain lashing against the boarded-up window, but inside the world narrowed down to the edge of the heavy quilt and the heat of Silas's skin. He set her down gently on the edge of the bed. He knelt before her, his large hands resting on her knees. The fierce, untouchable gunfighter was completely gone. In his place was a man on his knees, staring up at her as if she were a deity. With agonizing slowness, his trembling fingers reached for the ribbons of her nightgown. There was no rush, despite the ticking clock of their survival. They moved with a deliberate, agonizingly slow tenderness, as if they were trying to memorize every curve, every scar, every breath. When the cotton gown slipped from her shoulders, Silas's eyes darkened with a consuming, fiery worship. He stood up, pulling her to her feet. The cold air of the room kissed her bare skin, but it was instantly chased away by the crushing heat of his body as he pressed her against the mattress. "Evie," he groaned, his mouth trailing fire along her jawline, down the sensitive column of her throat. His calloused hands were shockingly gentle as they mapped the soft curves of her body, a violent man discovering an unfamiliar sacred peace. Evelyn's hands tangled in his dark hair, pulling him closer, her back arching off the quilt. She traced the broad, heavy muscles of his back, feeling the tension wired into his frame slowly begin to unravel. When they finally came together, it was not a frantic clash of bodies. It was a deep, soul-shattering connection. Silas let out a choked cry as he buried his face in the crook of her neck, his large frame trembling uncontrollably above her. Evelyn wrapped her legs around his waist, anchoring him, holding him, pulling him entirely out of the dark. Every touch, every desperate kiss, every whispered breath was a vow. It was a rejection of the violence waiting outside their walls. It was a defiant, beautiful claim on life. They moved together in the flickering candlelight, the rhythm of their bodies matching the steady, relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by guns and barricades, they found a profound, absolute sanctuary in each other. When the wave finally crested, breaking over them in a blinding, breathless rush, Silas collapsed against her. He held her so tightly Evelyn could barely breathe, but she didn't care. She buried her face against his scarred chest, listening to the frantic, beautiful beating of his heart, crying silent tears of pure, unadulterated love. For an hour they lay tangled in the heavy quilt, their limbs heavy, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Silas stroked her hair, his chin resting on top of her head. He didn't speak. The silence was absolute, perfect, and terrifyingly fragile, because they both knew it was ending. The ambient light in the room, what little of it leaked through the cracks in the boarded window, began to fade. The gray afternoon was surrendering to the pitch-black void of a stormy Montana night. Silas felt the shift in the air. Evelyn felt the exact moment his muscles locked, the tension returning to his spine like a coiled spring. The lover was fading back into the shadows. The gunfighter was returning. Silas slowly untangled himself from her arms. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand over his face. Evelyn sat up, pulling the quilt over her breasts. "What time is it?" Silas reached to the bedside table, picking up his silver pocket watch. He flicked it open. 6 o'clock, he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that had filled it an hour ago. He snapped the watch shut. "It's full dark outside." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. The sanctuary was gone. The war had arrived. She threw back the covers and stood up, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. She didn't reach for her nightgown. She reached for her heavy denim riding skirt, a thick flannel shirt, and her leather boots. She dressed with mechanical precision. Silas did the same. He pulled on a fresh shirt, hiding the scars, hiding the vulnerability. He shrugged into his heavy canvas duster. He picked up his gun belt, buckling the heavy leather strap around his waist, tying the holster down to his thigh with a leather thong so the Colt wouldn't shift when he moved. He checked the cylinder of the .45. 6 rounds, full. He slid it back into the holster. Evelyn picked up her Winchester. She checked the loading gate. 15 rounds, full. They walked out of the bedroom and into the dark parlor. Silas blew out the kerosene lamp on the dining table. The house plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The only illumination was the faint, dying red glow of the embers in the hearth. "Take your position," Silas whispered, his voice a disembodied rumble in the dark. Evelyn moved to the corner of the parlor, kneeling behind an overturned, heavy oak armchair, resting the barrel of the Winchester through the narrow gap in the boarded-up front window. Her view of the yard was limited, but she had a clear line of sight to the Eastern Creek ramp. Silas positioned himself by the reinforced front door, peering through a small knothole in the wood. The silence inside the house was deafening, juxtaposed against the violent roar of the rain outside. Evelyn's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her hands gripped the rifle, her finger hovering inches from the trigger guard. She strained her eyes into the darkness, searching for shadows, searching for movement. Nothing. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The waiting was a psychological torture, a slow, agonizing stretching of the nerves. Evelyn could hear Silas's breathing, slow and controlled, and she could hear something else. In the pitch-black silence of the parlor, over the drumming of the freezing rain, a rhythmic metallic sound echoed from Silas's direction. Tick, 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 tick. It was the silver pocket watch in his vest pocket. The sound was loud, steady, and utterly relentless. It was the heartbeat of the countdown. Evelyn stared into the dark. Her eyes burned. Her hands ached. 30 minutes passed. Suddenly the tick-tick-tick stopped. A sharp metallic clack echoed in the dark as Silas snapped the silver casing shut. From the eastern edge of the property, over the roar of the rain, a horrific metallic clang shattered the night, instantly followed by the high-pitched, agonizing scream of a man whose leg had just been crushed in the iron jaws of a bear trap. Silas's voice drifted through the darkness, cold as the grave. "They're here." The scream from the Eastern Creek ramp did not taper off. It tore through the freezing, torrential rain like a jagged blade, a horrific, high-pitched wail of pure agony. Inside the pitch-black parlor, Silas did not hesitate. He lunged toward his loophole in the boarded-up front window. The heavy Colt .45 in his hand roared, a deafening concussive blast in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash strobed blindingly bright, illuminating the room for a fraction of a second in stark, ghostly white. Boom! Boom! Silas fired twice into the dark. The screaming outside abruptly ceased, replaced by the frantic shouting of men scrambling for cover in the mud. "They're crossing the ramp!" Silas roared over the ringing in Evelyn's ears. "Cover the south line! Now!" Evelyn threw herself against the wall beside her designated loophole, her knees hitting the hard floorboards. Her hands were shaking violently, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps, but the brutal drills from the afternoon took over. She shoved the barrel of the Winchester through the narrow gap between the heavy oak beams. She squinted into the driving rain. It was impossible to see anything beyond the porch. Then, a sudden chaotic thrashing erupted from the southern tree line. A horse shrieked in terror, followed immediately by the heavy, sickening thud of a rider being violently clotheslined out of his saddle by the rusted barbed wire. "Wire caught one," a man's voice bellowed from the yard. "They trapped the perimeter. Shoot the house to splinters." Hell descended on the Montgomery ranch. The tree line lit up with a dozen simultaneous muzzle flashes. A hail of lead slammed into the cabin. The sound was apocalyptic, a relentless, deafening barrage of cracking wood, shattering glass, and high-velocity impacts. Bullets tore through the outer siding, burying themselves into the thick timber logs of the walls. Splinters the size of daggers exploded inward, raining down on Evelyn's head and shoulders. She screamed, ducking low, pressing her face against the dusty floorboards as lead chewed through the air inches above her head. "Shoot back!" Silas roared. He was a machine, calm in the center of the storm. He fired, stepped back to reload his six-shooter with blinding speed, and stepped forward to fire again. "Evelyn, give me suppressing fire on the south line. Do not let them advance." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, visualizing the loading gate, the brass cartridges, the cold steel lever. "I am not a victim." She forced herself up to her knees. She shoved the Winchester through the loophole, aiming blindly into the dark where the muzzle flashes were thickest. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard into her shoulder, a powerful, bruising recoil. Clack, clack. She racked the lever, the spent brass casing flying over her shoulder to hit the floor. Boom, clack, clack, boom. She didn't know if she hit anything. She didn't care. She was fighting back. The smell of sulfur and burnt gunpowder rapidly filled the parlor, thick and choking. The air grew hot, hazy with white smoke that stung her eyes. "3 down," Silas grunted, his voice tight with exertion. "But there are too many. They're fanning out. Keep firing, Evie. Count your shots." 8, 9, 10. Outside, the gunfire suddenly slacked. The shouting stopped. For 30 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the relentless pounding of the freezing rain on the roof and Evelyn's own ragged breathing. "Did they retreat?" she gasped, her hands cramped around the rifle stock. Silas didn't answer. He was staring through his loophole, his pale eyes narrowing in the dark. Suddenly, a faint, flickering orange glow blossomed through the cracks in the barricaded windows. The light grew rapidly, shifting from a dim glow to a roaring, violent brilliance that cast terrifying, dancing shadows across the walls of the parlor. "No," Evelyn whispered, the blood draining from her face. She pushed her eye to the gap in the wood. Thorne's men hadn't retreated. They had regrouped, and they had thrown kerosene lanterns into the hayloft of the barn. The massive wooden structure was a towering inferno, the flames roaring 50 feet into the rainy night sky. The fire illuminated the entire yard in a hellish, flickering orange daylight. "My horses," Evelyn choked out, a sob tearing at her throat. "I let them loose into the back pasture an hour ago," Silas said quickly, not taking his eyes off the yard. "The barn is gone, Evelyn, but they just made a fatal mistake. They gave us light." Through the loophole, Evelyn saw them. There were at least 10 men left, wearing dark dusters and wide-brimmed hats, advancing through the freezing mud, using the burning barn as a distraction. "Take the ones on the left," Silas ordered, raising his Colt. "I've got the right." Evelyn aimed. She didn't close her eyes this time. She found the silhouette of a man running toward the porch with a rifle. She squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled, dropping his weapon, and fell face first into the sloughing brown mud. 11. She racked the lever. Boom! Another man staggered back, clutching his shoulder. 12. I'm at 12, she yelled. Keep shooting, Silas barked. They're rushing the porch. 3 men hit the wooden steps of the porch at a full sprint. Silas dropped one with a shot to the chest, but the other 2 reached the front door. They weren't shooting. They were carrying a heavy 6-foot section of a felled pine log, a battering ram. Crash! The entire house shuddered. The heavy oak front door bowed inward, the iron hinges groaning in protest. The reinforced chair Evelyn had wedged under the handle splintered slightly. "They're on the door!" Evelyn screamed, swinging her rifle toward the entryway. Crash! The frame cracked. Wood snapped with the sound of a breaking bone. Silas stepped out from his cover, leveling his revolver directly at the center of the heavy oak door. He pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy .45 caliber slugs blew massive holes right through the wood. A man on the other side screamed and fell away. But Silas's hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He reached for his gun belt to reload. "I'm out," Silas yelled. "Evelyn, cover the door." Crash! The iron deadbolt sheared off. The barricade chair shattered into kindling. The front door exploded inward, ripped off its hinges, crashing violently onto the parlor floor. Freezing rain and the roar of the burning barn rushed into the house. 2 men poured through the broken doorway, their revolvers raised. Evelyn swung her Winchester up, the barrel leveled squarely at the first man's chest. She pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The lever was jammed. A brass casing had caught in the ejection port, freezing the mechanism solid. Evelyn stared at the jammed rifle, her heart completely stopping in her chest. The man in the doorway sneered, raising his gun toward her. Before he could fire, a massive shadow slammed into him. Silas didn't have time to reload. He threw himself across the room, tackling the gunman around the waist. They hit the floorboards in a chaotic tangle of limbs and mud. Silas brought his heavy, calloused fist down in a brutal, crushing arc, knocking the man unconscious instantly. But the second gunman stepped over the threshold, leveling a sawed-off shotgun directly at Silas's back as he knelt on the floor. "Hold it right there, Vance," a slick, venomous voice echoed from the porch. The second gunman didn't shoot. He stepped aside, keeping his weapon trained on Silas, allowing a third man to step through the ruined doorway and out of the rain. He was impeccably dressed, despite the mud and the storm. He wore a tailored black suit beneath an open oilskin coat, a crimson silk vest, and a pristine bowler hat. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and lined with a cruel, permanent amusement. Harlan Blackjack Thorne stepped into Evelyn's parlor. He looked around the ruined, smoke-filled room, stepping delicately over the shattered door. His eyes briefly flicked to Evelyn, kneeling in the corner with a jammed rifle, before settling on Silas, who was slowly rising to his feet, his broad chest heaving. Thorne reached into his coat and pulled out an ornate, silver-plated Smith & Wesson revolver. With agonizing slowness, he raised the weapon, stepping forward until the cold steel barrel was pressed directly against the center of Silas's forehead. "Hello, accountant," Thorne smiled, the firelight reflecting in his dead obsidian eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The burning barn cast a flickering, hellish light across the ruined parlor. The rain blew through the shattered doorway, soaking the floorboards, but inside the air was entirely devoid of oxygen. Silas Vance did not flinch. With the barrel of Harlan Thorne's silver revolver pressed firmly between his eyes, he stood as still and solid as a mountain pine. His broad shoulders were squared, his pale eyes locked onto the railroad baron with a hatred so pure and absolute it practically hummed in the air. "The ledger is gone, Thorne," Silas grated out, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "I burned it 2 days ago. You came all this way, lost half your men in the mud for a pile of ash." Thorne's cruel smile didn't waver. He cocked the hammer of his revolver. The metallic click echoed loudly in the tense silence. "You lie just as poorly as Arthur did," Thorne murmured softly. "You didn't burn my ledger, Silas. A man like you, a man looking for redemption, needs proof to hang me. It's here, and I will burn this house down piece by piece until I find it." Thorne's obsidian eyes slid sideways, locking onto Evelyn, who was still kneeling in the corner, her fingers desperately trying to pry the jammed casing from her Winchester. "But first," Thorne continued, his voice dripping with venom, "I require the deed to this property. I understand congratulations are in order, Mrs. Vance. A tragically short honeymoon. Give me the deed, and I might just let you walk away into the snow a widow, rather than a corpse." "Go to hell," Evelyn spat. She dropped the jammed rifle. She didn't cower. She stood up, her chin tilted high, her eyes blazing with the same fierce, unyielding fire as the burning barn outside. "My father bled for this land. I will see you hang before I hand you a single blade of grass." Thorne chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Spirited. I like that. It's a shame." He tightened his finger on the trigger, his eyes snapping back to Silas. "Goodbye, Mr. Vance." Evelyn screamed, lunging forward. But before the hammer could fall, a sound echoed from the darkness of the porch outside. It was not a gunshot. It was a mechanical, synchronized symphony. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. 10 lever-action rifles were cocked simultaneously. Thorne froze. The two gunmen behind him whipped around, raising their weapons toward the doorway, their faces paling in the orange light of the fire. Stepping out of the freezing rain and onto the splintered porch was Sheriff Miller of Oakhaven. He was soaking wet, holding a double-barreled shotgun leveled directly at Thorne's chest. And he was not alone. Fanning out behind him in the mud, illuminated by the burning barn, were a dozen men from the town. The blacksmith, the general store owner, the stable boy Silas had helped a week prior. They were armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and revolvers. They looked terrified, but they stood shoulder to shoulder, an impenetrable wall of frontier justice. "Drop the weapon, Blackjack," Sheriff Miller boomed, his voice cutting through the roar of the rain, "or they'll be burying you in a bucket." Thorne's eyes darted frantically. He was surrounded. He had brought an army of thugs, but the town of Oakhaven had brought a community. The banker, Josiah Crane, had been too arrogant, bragging in the saloon about foreclosing on the Montgomery girl. The town had heard the gunfire. They had chosen a side. "This is a private dispute, Sheriff," Thorne said, his voice tightening, though he didn't lower his gun from Silas's head. "Vance is a wanted man. He stole my property." "I have a federal warrant for your arrest, Thorne, wired in from St. Louis this morning," the sheriff replied evenly. "Extortion, bribery, and the murder of Arthur Penhaligon. Now step away from the man, drop the silver gun, and tell your boys to throw their irons in the mud." Thorne's two gunmen immediately dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. They were paid to intimidate, not to die in a crossfire. Thorne, however, did not lower his weapon. His face twisted into an ugly, desperate snarl. His empire was crumbling in the mud of a Montana ranch. He looked at Silas, his eyes burning with a manic, cornered fury. "I'm not going to a federal rope," Thorne hissed, his finger trembling on the trigger. "If I go down, Vance, you're coming to hell with me." "Hold your fire," Sheriff Miller yelled to his men, seeing Thorne's desperation. If Thorne pulled the trigger, Silas was dead, and the resulting crossfire would slaughter everyone in the parlor. Silas didn't blink. He stared down the barrel of the gun, entirely unafraid. He had made his peace with death a long time ago. "You want me, Thorne?" Silas said, his voice eerily calm, cutting through the panic. "Then do it like a man, not like a coward shooting a hostage in a parlor." Thorne narrowed his eyes. "What are you proposing?" "The yard," Silas challenged, his voice cold and hard as iron. He slowly raised his hands, showing they were empty. "You and me, in the mud. You win, you take a horse and you ride out. The sheriff won't stop you. I lose. Well, I won't be around to care." "No!" Evelyn screamed, grabbing Silas's arm. "Silas, don't! He's a murderer! The sheriff has him!" Silas looked down at her. The lethal gunfighter melted away, leaving only the man who had kissed her in the dark. He reached out, his rough thumb brushing a streak of mud and tears from her cheek. "He won't surrender, Evie," Silas whispered softly, for her ears only. "If he shoots me here, the town will fire into the house. You'll be caught in the crossfire. I have to take him outside." "You can't," she sobbed, clutching his shirt. "I promised I would keep you safe," he murmured, his pale eyes burning with absolute devotion. "I love you, Evelyn. Remember that." He gently untangled her fingers from his shirt. He turned back to Thorn. "Well?" Thorn lowered his silver revolver an inch. A cruel, arrogant smirk returned to his face. He fancied himself a gentleman duelist, a man of superior reflexes. "Step outside, Mr. Vance." The sheriff and his men backed away, forming a wide, tense circle in the muddy, rain-slicked yard. The burning barn crackled fiercely, casting long, erratic shadows across the combatants. Silas stepped off the porch. His boots sank into the freezing, ankle-deep muck. The rain plastered his shirt to his heavily scarred chest. He walked 10 paces into the yard and turned, his arms hanging loose at his sides, his hands hovering inches from the grips of his empty holsters. Thorn stepped down opposite him. He shrugged off his heavy oilskin coat, letting it drop into the mud, revealing his tailored suit. He holstered his silver-plated revolver. Evelyn stood on the splintered threshold of her home, her hands clamped over her mouth, her heart tearing itself to pieces in her chest. The rain drummed heavily against the earth. The fire roared. "On my count," Sheriff Miller yelled, holding a pocket watch up in the orange light. "You draw on 3. 1." Silas stared at Thorn. His mind went entirely blank. There was no fear. There was no guilt. There was only the rain, the mud, and the man who had murdered his best friend. 2! A massive, blinding fork of lightning spiderwebbed across the black Montana sky, immediately followed by a concussive boom of thunder that shook the ground. 3! Thorn moved with the speed of a striking viper. He was incredibly fast, his hand blurring as he drew the silver revolver from his hip. Silas moved, his muscle memory taking over, his hand dropping to the Colt .45 on his thigh. But Thorn was a fraction of a second faster. Thorn fired. The gunshot cracked through the rainy night. Silas's body violently jerked backward, the sheer kinetic force of the heavy lead slug hitting him squarely in the left side of his chest, directly over his heart. "Silas!" Evelyn's scream was a sound of pure, soul-shredding devastation. Silas collapsed backward into the sloughing brown mud. He didn't move. He lay flat on his back, the freezing rain washing over his face, his unblinking eyes staring up at the black, stormy sky. Thorn let out a breathless, triumphant laugh. He lowered his smoking gun, looking around at the stunned, horrified faces of the townspeople. "A fair fight, Sheriff. You all saw it. Now step aside." Evelyn fell to her knees on the porch, a terrible, agonizing sob tearing from her lungs. It was over. The ghost had returned to the dark. But out in the mud, something shifted. A low, hacking cough echoed from the ground. Thorn's smile vanished. Slowly, agonizingly, Silas Vance rolled onto his side. He planted his large, mud-caked hand into the earth, his corded muscles trembling violently with effort. With a guttural groan, he pushed himself up to one knee. He wasn't dead. Thorn stared, his obsidian eyes wide with absolute, uncomprehending horror. It was impossible. He had aimed directly for the heart. Silas knelt in the mud, his chest heaving. He reached his left hand inside his vest pocket. His fingers fumbled for a second before pulling something out. He held it up in the flickering light of the burning barn. It was his heavy silver pocket watch. The casing was completely, utterly obliterated. A flattened lead bullet was embedded deep in the shattered gears and springs, stopped just a fraction of an inch from passing through the thick silver backing. The violent impact had cracked Silas's ribs, dropping him to the ground. But the watch had stopped the bullet from piercing his heart. The heavy, relentless tick-tick-tick of his past was finally permanently silent. Silas dropped the ruined silver watch into the mud. He looked up at Thorn. His pale eyes were no longer those of a wandering ghost. They were the eyes of a man who had finally found his sunrise, and he was not going to let anyone take it away. Thorne panicked. He frantically raised his silver revolver to fire again. He never got the chance. From a kneeling position, Silas drew his Colt .45 in a blur of motion so fast the eye could barely track it. He didn't aim. He fired purely on instinct. Boom. The bullet struck Thorne's silver revolver dead center, shattering the weapon and taking 3 of Thorne's fingers with it. Thorne shrieked in agony, spinning like a top before collapsing to his knees in the mud, clutching his mangled, bleeding hand to his chest. The yard fell dead silent, save for the rain and Thorne's pathetic, whimpering cries. Silas slowly stood up. He holstered his smoking Colt. He didn't look at Thorne as Sheriff Miller and his deputies rushed forward to drag the weeping railroad baron out of the mud and slap iron shackles on his wrists. Silas turned his back on the carnage. He looked toward the porch. Evelyn was already running. She didn't care about the mud or the rain or the townspeople watching. She threw herself off the wooden steps, sprinting through the muck until she crashed violently into his chest. Silas caught her, his large arms wrapping around her, lifting her off her feet. He buried his face in her wet auburn hair, holding her so tightly he could feel the frantic, beautiful beating of her heart against his own. "You're alive!" she sobbed hysterically, her hands roaming frantically over his face, his shoulders, feeling the solid, breathing reality of him. "You're alive!" "I told you," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his tears mixing with the freezing rain on his cheeks. He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips, tasting the salt and the mud and the profound, absolute miracle of survival. "I'm not going anywhere, Evie. I'm right here." He looked down at the mud near his boots. The shattered silver pocket watch lay half buried in the muck, glinting faintly in the firelight. The tether to his violent, guilty past was broken. It was dead and gone, washed away by the Montana rain. Silas Vance pulled his wife closer to his chest, turned his back on the dark, and carried her inside their home. Montana in May was not merely a season. It was an apology. After a brutal, suffocating winter that froze the marrow in the bones, the land exhaled. The 3-foot snowdrifts melted into a rushing crystalline torrent that swelled the eastern creek, feeding the soil until the valley exploded into an emerald sea of prairie grass and vibrant purple lupine. The air smelled of damp earth, sweet pine, and absolute, undeniable life. Evelyn Vance stood on the wraparound porch of her home, leaning against the newly carved wooden railing. She held a steaming mug of coffee, watching the golden morning sun crest the distant mountain ridge, washing the valley in a warm, honeyed light. The house behind her bore the scars of its history. A few patched bullet holes in the timber siding, a brand-new heavy oak front door, but it was whole. And across the yard, standing proud and smelling of fresh-cut lumber, was a massive new barn, raised in early April with the help of 20 men from Oakhaven. The town had not forgotten the night the Montgomery Ranch held the line. Evelyn took a sip of her coffee, a deep, resonant peace settling in her chest. The nightmare was truly over. Harlan Blackjack Thorne was dead, hanged by the neck in a federal courtyard in Helena 3 months prior. Arthur's ledger had been the silver bullet that shattered Thorne's empire. When the federal marshals took possession of the book, it unraveled a web of extortion, bribery, and murder that stretched across 3 territories. The corrupt bank manager, Josiah Crane, was currently rotting in a territorial prison. The Montgomery deed was ironclad, stamped and sealed by a federal judge. The water rights belonged to Evelyn and Silas permanently. Evelyn lowered her mug as the steady, rhythmic thud of galloping hooves echoed across the pasture. Silas was riding back from the northern fence line. He sat tall and easy in the saddle of his massive black gelding, moving in perfect, fluid sync with the animal. He wore a faded blue canvas workshirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal tanned, corded forearms. The low-crowned Stetson shaded his eyes from the morning sun. But it was what he wasn't wearing that made Evelyn's heart swell with an overwhelming, tender ache. There was no heavy leather gun belt strapped to his thigh. The Colt. 45 was locked inside the gun cabinet in the parlor. For the first time since he was a 15-year-old boy, Silas Vance was unarmed. He no longer scanned the tree line for assassins. He no longer slept with one eye open, listening for the snap of a twig. The haunted, exhausted ghost who had stepped off the train 6 months ago was gone. In his place was a rancher, a partner, a man who finally, truly believed he deserved the air he breathed. Silas pulled the gelding to a halt near the porch, swinging down from the saddle with effortless grace. He tied the reins to the hitching post, gave the horse an affectionate pat on the neck, and turned toward the house. When he looked up and saw Evelyn standing on the porch, a slow, breathtaking smile broke across his handsome face. It fundamentally changed him, smoothing away the hard, lethal lines of his jaw and lighting up his pale eyes with a warmth that rivaled the Montana sun. He walked up the wooden steps, the spurs gone from his boots. He didn't say a word. He stepped into her space, taking the coffee mug from her hands and setting it on the railing. His large, calloused hands spanned her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Evelyn went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck, lifting her face to his. Their kiss was unhurried, deep, and tasting of morning coffee and profound contentment. There was no desperate, frantic edge to it anymore, no fear that this might be their last moment together. It was the kiss of a man who had the rest of his life and knew exactly who he wanted to spend it with. Silas pulled back slightly, resting his forehead against hers. "Morning, Mrs. Vance." "Morning," she murmured, her fingers playing with the dark, unruly hair at the nape of his neck. "Did you finish the northern stretch?" "Post holes are dug. We'll string the wire tomorrow," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that she felt deep in her chest. He pulled back, looking out over the sprawling green valley. "Grass is coming in thick. We can easily support another 50 head of cattle by midsummer, just like you projected." "Arthur would be proud of those numbers," Evelyn smiled softly, resting her cheek against his shoulder. Silas's chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful breath. "Yeah, he would be." The grief over Arthur's death had not vanished, but it had transformed from a jagged, bleeding wound into a quiet, respectful memory. They had erected a small, beautiful stone marker under the surviving oak tree in the yard in his honor. The man who had unknowingly orchestrated their salvation would always have a place on their land. The day passed in a rhythm of hard, satisfying labor. They worked side by side, repairing tack, clearing brush, and painting the new corral fences. It was exhausting work, but it was the kind of fatigue that fed the soul rather than draining it. By the time evening arrived, the sky above the valley had transformed into a spectacular, breathtaking canvas. The fading sun painted the wispy clouds in vibrant strokes of crushed violet, burning crimson and spun gold. It was the fabled big sky, immense and humbling. Evelyn had just finished washing up in the kitchen. She dried her hands on a towel, walking out to the front porch. Silas was already there. He had changed into a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair damp from washing at the pump. He was standing at the edge of the porch, leaning against the wooden post, staring out at the sunset. As Evelyn walked out, the floorboards creaked. Silas turned. For a fleeting second, Evelyn saw a flash of an emotion she hadn't seen on his face in months. He looked nervous. The lethal gunfighter who had stared down the barrel of Harlan Thorne's gun without blinking was shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his broad shoulders unusually rigid. "Silas?" Evelyn asked, a gentle frown creasing her brow. She stepped up beside him. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said quickly, his voice a little rougher than usual. He cleared his throat, turning to face her fully. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is exactly right." He reached into the left pocket of his vest. It was the pocket where he had once carried the heavy silver watch that had saved his life. The pocket directly over the massive scar on his heart. He didn't pull out a watch. Silas pulled out a small square box covered in dark blue velvet. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted from the box to his face. Silas looked down at her left hand. Resting on her ring finger was the heavy, unadorned iron band he had placed there in the sheriff's office 6 months ago. "When I put that ring on your finger," Silas said softly, his pale eyes holding hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity, "it was a shackle. It was a business transaction forged in terror and desperation. I was a man waiting to die, and you were a woman backed into a corner by monsters." He took her left hand in his calloused thumb gently brushing over the cold iron. "I told you I would be your shield, Evelyn," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you I would secure your deed, and when you were safe, I would ride out. I thought that was the only honorable thing a man with my past could do." "Silas, you don't ever have to leave," Evelyn whispered, tears instantly pricking her eyes. "This is your home." "I know," he smiled, a breathtakingly tender expression. "You taught me that. You stood in the snow, and you fought for me when I didn't think I was worth fighting for. You took a broken, violent man, and you gave him a sunrise." Silas slowly slid the heavy iron ring off her finger. He didn't throw it away. He slipped it into his own pocket, keeping it as a reminder of where they had started. Then he opened the blue velvet box. Resting on a bed of white silk was a delicate, exquisitely crafted band of pure gold. Set into the center of the gold was a single brilliant Montana sapphire. It was a deep, mesmerizing shade of blue, the exact color of the twilight sky stretching out above them. Evelyn let out a soft, choked gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Tears spilled over her lashes, tracking hot and fast down her cheeks. Silas took the gold ring from the box. His large hands, capable of such terrifying violence, were remarkably steady and gentle as he held the delicate jewelry. "Arthur was the one who wrote the first letter," Silas murmured, his voice dropping to a profound, intimate whisper. "But I was the one who fell in love with you. I fell in love with your courage. I fell in love with your words. And every day since I stepped off that train, I have fallen deeper in love with your soul." He stepped closer, the heat of his body enveloping her in the cool evening air. "I am not an accountant, Evelyn," Silas said, looking deeply into her tear-filled eyes. "I am just a man who finally found his quiet dawn. And I am asking you, not out of fear, not out of a bargain, but out of my own free will." Silas Vance, the former gunslinger of the Western Plains, slowly dropped to one knee on the wooden porch of the home they had defended with their blood. "Evelyn," he asked, his voice cracking with the sheer weight of his love, "will you do me the absolute, undeserved honor of being my wife? For real? For the rest of my life?" Evelyn couldn't speak. Her throat was entirely closed, tight with a joy so profound it physically ached. She looked down at the man kneeling before her, seeing the scars, the strength, the incredible journey he had taken from the dark into the light. She didn't need to find the words. She dropped to her knees right in front of him, the skirts of her dress pooling on the porch boards. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her wet face against his shoulder, sobbing a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. Silas let out a breathless laugh, his powerful arms wrapping around her waist, crushing her to his chest. "Yes," she finally managed to choke out against his collar. She pulled back just enough to look at his face, her eyes shining with absolute devotion. "Yes, Silas. Yes, 1,000 times over." Silas's eyes were bright with his own tears. He took her left hand, his thumb trembling slightly, and slid the gold and sapphire ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It wasn't a shackle. It was a promise. He cupped her face and brought his mouth down on hers. The kiss was a vow, sealed under the darkening Montana sky. It held the memory of the freezing blizzard, the smoke of the burning barn, and the terror of the mud, but it transcended all of it. It was a kiss of absolute victory. They stood up together, Silas pulling her flush against his side, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder, her left hand resting on his chest, the sapphire catching the last dying light of the sun. They looked out over the sprawling green valley. The land was quiet, peaceful, and entirely theirs. Evelyn Montgomery had ordered a husband through the mail, hoping for a gentle scholar to save her from ruin. Instead, fate had sent her an armed cowboy, a dangerous, haunted man who had brought a war to her doorstep. But as the first stars of the evening began to pierce the twilight, shining down on the sanctuary they had built together, Evelyn knew the absolute truth. She hadn't just gotten the man who wrote the letters. She had gotten the man who was meant for her soul. Silas pressed a soft kiss to her temple, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The ghosts were gone. The night held no more terrors. They stood together on the porch, two survivors forged in the fire, finally home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.